is Tom Brinthaupt. I'm a professor of psychology at Middle Tennessee State University in the US. I'm a personality psychologist interested in a range of individual differences as well as self and identity processes. And I've been studying self-talk for the past 20 years or so. Um, and I'd like to talk about some of that today. I, of course, would like to thank the International Society for Dialogical Science for providing this opportunity for me to talk about some of my research and thinking about self-talk and internal dialogues and the dialogical self. So my plan in this brief clip is to discuss different kinds of self-talk and intrapersonal communication, what we call that, ways that we can measure that, at least a scale that I've developed, some research on frequency and the nature of self-talk, and I'd like to highlight some interesting questions on when and why people might talk to themselves, engage in these different kinds of intrapersonal communication. And I want to end with talking about some what I think would be really interesting studies, as well as some of the things that we're doing, our team is doing currently to test out some of these questions. Basically, what I'd like to try to do is show you how a personality psychologist, or at least I, as a personality psychologist, thinks about the different ways that we communicate with ourselves. So I'll start off with this first slide, which is a very simplified presentation of different modes of communication. Other people have talked about this as a kind of a continuum between talking to others on the one hand and talking to ourselves on the other, with inner dialogues, talking to ourselves in our self-talk, if you will, being in the middle. And I kind of use this as an organizing principle that guides some of our research. It's an interesting way to think about these different modes of communication. If there are parallels, there should be, it seems to me, parallels in terms of the nature and the mechanisms of interpersonal communication. So when we talk to others, the rules, the functions, the preferences, the concerns we have, those should parallel, one would think, intrapersonal communication. So our self-talk and inner dialogues. Are there similar rules and functions and preferences and concerns? We will use other people as sounding boards. We do that very often, I think, trying out ideas or possibilities, alternatives, seeing what other people think, helping to define ourselves based on the feedback we get socially. Do we do the same thing in our self-talk and inner dialogues? That is, do we use ourselves and the internal audiences of our inner dialogues as sounding boards? I think the evidence is very strong that we do that. The other point I'd make here is when we talk about identity formation and development, that all three of these communication categories or these domains are relevant to that process. I think there's very good evidence to support that as well. So let me say a little bit about the nature and frequency of self-talk, at least as personality psychologists think about it. There are lots of different features and dimensions of self-talk and inner dialogue. We talk about positive and negative self-talk, instructional and motivational self-talk, spontaneous as opposed to more strategic or planned or goal-directed self-talk. There are different inner dialogue functions: analyzing, bonding, fantasizing, ruminating, testing reality. So there's all these different features and functions associated with self-talk and inner dialogues. And in an effort to try to study this, some 10 years ago or so, we published a scale called the self-talk scale. And as this slide shows, it's basically the structure of the scale. There's an overall general self-talk frequency category, if you will, and then we identified 4 facets or functions that self-talk serves. We engage in self-criticizing self-talk, self-reinforcing, self-managing, and social assessing self-talk. So I look at this phenomenon of self-talk as reflecting a self-regulatory process. So we engage in self-talk and internal dialogues to express our points of view or our emotions, our thoughts, or attitudes, to relieve stress, to explore. I think especially in adolescence, again, the exploration and formation of identity seems closely tied, or it should be closely tied, to the content and frequency of our self-talk and internal dialogues. We actually have some unpublished data with high school students compared to college student samples. And the adolescents, the high school students, report more frequent self-talk on the self-talk scale. So there's some evidence initially supporting that idea, perhaps. So as a personality psychologist, I'm mostly interested in individual differences in self-talk frequency. And when we give the self-talk scale out, what we find is there are some people that report talking to themselves like literally all the time, whereas other people report never or hardly ever talking to themselves. But most people are in the middle. So if you look at the frequency distribution of scores on the self-talk scale, it forms a nice bell-shaped curve. And that's nice. But what I'm mainly interested in is like what accounts for, what could potentially explain the differences in people's reports of talking very frequently to themselves or not very often to themselves. And so what we've tried to do over the last several years is explore different ways of addressing that question. When we look at individual differences as personality psychologists, there's a crucial question that always comes up, and that's what this slide is showing, the interplay between personal factors, my general tendencies to talk to myself and to others, say, and situational factors, social environmental factors that might increase or decrease my tendency to talk to others. So we have been trying to explore both personal factors, individual difference factors, as well as situational factors that might be associated with greater or less frequency of self-talk. So this next slide is just an example, going back to the self-talk scale, of the bidirectionality in terms of these different domains of communication. I think a good example of this is how we might consider what I call social assessing self-talk, where our self-talk and inner dialogues contribute to the rehearsing of an upcoming conversation or an interaction. What am I going to say? Should I say this? What if they say that? Kind of thinking, which then plays back to our actual interactions and affects those interactions. And similarly, once we've had an interaction, we've talked to someone, our inner dialogues and our self-talk participate in kind of assessing that and evaluating that, replaying that conversation. Why did she say that? Why did I shouldn't have said that. That was a dumb thing to say, that kind of thing. So there really is this circularity and bidirectionality. I'd like to just point that out. So in terms of what we've been testing, there's a couple hypotheses that I've been especially interested in. And one is more of, it's kind of a combination of situational and personal, but it's mostly situational. And this slide is reflecting that hypothesis, what I call social isolation hypothesis, where the rationale is we're motivated to create or manage our social interactions via our self-talk and inner dialogues whenever our social experiences are limited or unsatisfactory for whatever reason. So here, examples might be early childhood or early learning experiences. So for example, being an only child or having had an imaginary companion in childhood, that should be associated with more frequent self-talk. We actually studied that and found that. And then there are also current situational factors that might affect or be related to social isolation. So living alone, or being socially distanced or isolated during a pandemic. Anecdotally, I've heard from several colleagues and friends and students that their self-talk is increasing, has been increasing during the pandemic. So that'd be a really interesting study to see if that kind of situation uh, gets us to or forces us to compensate for our socially isolating experiences by increasing our self-talk. So this idea, what I'm showing here with the arrows on this figure are that generally, as socially isolating experiences increase, self-talk and inner dialogues should increase. Talking to others, I'm not sure where to go there because it really depends on why you're socially isolated. If I'm socially isolated because I'm not socially skilled and I embarrass other people or they don't like me and they reject me, and so having more of those experiences might actually lead to decreases in my interest in interacting with others. Whereas if I really need and thrive on the interactions with others and I'm lacking that, then I want to go out and increase my conversations and my contact with others, even if it's not safe. Okay, so there is actually moderate support for this hypothesis. The effect sizes tend to be in the low to moderate range, but there is some support for this idea. The second hypothesis is what's shown here on this slide, what I call cognitive disruption hypothesis. And the idea here is that when we have experiences that are cognitively disruptive, so that by that I mean anomalous, upsetting, disturbing, self-related experiences, when we have those, they should press us into trying to resolve them or understand or clarify those experiences. This is that self-regulatory process idea that I referred to earlier. So here again, there may be general personal tendencies, such as high scores on measures of schizotypy or dissociative experiences. We have evidence suggesting that higher scores on schizotypy, milder version of kind of schizophrenic tendencies, are associated with more frequent self-talk. There's also situational factors, and here there's just a bevy of things that should be associated with increasing self-talk and increasing internal dialogues, as well as increasing talking to other people. So when we encounter a novel or stressful situation, for example, when we're surprised or accused of being somebody that we're not, receiving a challenge to a belief or to our normal ways of thinking, and the research in this area provides strong support. Here again, the effect sizes range from moderate to strong. So here's some interesting research questions that I hope can continue to illustrate how I would, as a personality psychologist, kind of think about this, the interesting questions about self-talk and internal dialogues. One is that I've noticed that some people are very talkative. And there should be some measures. I think there are some measures of general talkativeness. How is that related to talking to ourselves? Is there a general loquaciousness that applies to our self-talk and our inner dialogues as well as talking to others? I'm not aware of any research that addresses that question, but I think that'd be really interesting. It would suggest that I'm talkative, and I'm talkative in all these different domains as an individual difference factor. Another area is, especially when people speak or write, we often talk about having a style or a voice. Sometimes in written work, we can immediately identify who the author is, for example. Are there parallels of style and voice in our self-talk and inner dialogues? That is, could we identify a kind of a profile in terms of the content and the frequency and the functions that our dialogues serve or our self-talk serve? I thought an interesting way to maybe approach this might be to have people record verbatim an episode of self-talk or inner dialogue, and then collect those from a bunch of people and see if people who know the author are more accurate at identifying which record is theirs. In essence, just like we would say when we hear somebody talking, that sounds like something they would say. Are we able to make accurate determinations along the lines of that sounds like something they would be saying to themselves? I think that's a really interesting question. The third area that came to mind as I was thinking about these questions is the difference between what we say in interacting in our social interactions, talking to others, small talk and the opposite of that, which is I'll call deep talk, but it's like intense, deep conversations versus small surface talk. Weather's nice today, isn't it? Yeah, it is. Yeah, yeah. Good to see you. Okay, right. So those different levels of depth of talking to others. Is there a parallel with our inner dialogues and our self-talk? Do we essentially engage in small self-talk and small inner dialogues uh, and deep? I think we probably do. It'd be interesting to consider how we could actually study that. I'm not sure how we could study that. I'll close with a couple of current projects that our team is working on that are both personality, personal factors, and situational factors. One is we're currently collecting research that has looked at self-talk frequency across different cultures. We have a large database now of different researchers who have used the self-talk scale. And here we're looking at broader cultural factors like individualism and collectivism, and whether that would be associated with overall frequency and the frequency of specific facets of self-talk. I've been interested in bilingualism for a long time, even though I'm not bilingual myself. Um, I obviously know many people who are, and we've talked often about the flipping between native tongue and second language, and what situations does that occur, and does it occur? How does it occur within self-talk? I think that's really an interesting question. One of my students is currently coming up with a way of creating a personal disruption with our participants and then seeing how they would react to that. What we're probably going to do initially is have people reflect on a recent experience that was cognitively disruptive and then talk about how they reacted to that. Again, in those situations, the cognitive disruption hypothesis, we're thinking that should be associated with increased self-talk. On the personality side, there's a couple of factors that I've been thinking should be related to less frequent self-talk rather than more. And the two that we're studying currently in a couple of studies is our mindfulness or mindful awareness and an overall sense of self or strength or coherent sense of self. And in both of those cases, the more mindfully aware we are, presumably, the less frequent we should be talking to ourselves generally. And those individuals with a stronger, more coherent sense of self should also not have to try to figure themselves out as much, basically. And so they should report less frequent self-talk. So we're in the process of actually collecting data on that now. And then the final point is personal pronoun usage, something I've been fascinated by for a long time, but have difficulty in how to study that. And uh, I think there are likely to be individual differences in the frequency of use of in my self-talk or inner dialogue when I use I or you or my name. And so I think that would be really interesting to study. There's likely to be differences, maybe in terms of things like perfectionism or something like that. I would think perfectionists might be more likely to use their names or you. Why did you do that? That was dumb. Tom, don't say that. That was stupid. Cut this out, please. That kind of thinking and what I'm using in the actual content of my self-talk, I think would be very interesting to explore, as would, of course, the use of different pronouns within one's inner dialogues and the relation to different I positions. That would be really, really cool to study. So I'll stop here. Thank you for your interest in our work. If you'd like to learn more about these projects or ideas, or if you're interested in a research collaboration, just let me know. This last slide is a thank you to a couple of my colleagues, some relevant citations. Much of what I was talking about in this brief presentation, you can find more details in these studies, and my contact information. Thanks again.